Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. My name is Sagar Bhavishi, and I have the privilege of moderating today's Talks at Google session. Before we get started, I'd like to take a minute to introduce our guest for today, Tim Wu. Thank you. Tim is an author, policy advocate, and professor at Columbia University, and he is best known for coining the term net neutrality. In 2006, Scientific American named him one of the 50 leaders in science and technology. In 2007, 01238 magazine listed him as one of Harvard's 100 most influential graduates. In 2013, National Law Journal included him in America's 100 most influential lawyers, and in 2014 and 15, he was named to Politico 50. He formerly wrote for Slate, where he won the Lowell Thomas Gold Award for travel journalism, and is a contributing writer for The New Yorker. In 2015, he was appointed to the executive staff of the Office of the New York State Attorney General, Eric Schneiderman, as a senior enforcement counsel and special advisor. Without ruining much of the book, The Attention Merchants provides a revelatory look at the rise of attention harvesting and its transformative effect on our society and ourselves. It serves as an illuminating, urgent look at how businesses commodify our attention and what we lose when we give that to them. We will be conducting a Q&A session towards the end of the event, so please hold off on your questions until then. There will also be a book signing at the back there, so feel free to grab one of Tim's books, which is at a subsidized rate, and that's exclusive to Googlers. Without further ado, I present to you Tim to talk about his new book, The Attention Merchants.
Great. Thanks so much. I have this mic right here, right? Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming. I appreciate it. It is really an honor and a pleasure to come here for a number of reasons. First, I actually worked in this building for a while and came down here with some frequency when Spotify was in this building, and I was helping them with some trouble they were having with Apple back a couple of years ago. But I think even more straightforwardly, I also spent time at Google, not this office, but at the Mountain View offices. I have a great affection for the company. I was on a volleyball team. This was back in the early 2000s, and I was working with a legal group. This is, about 10 years ago. No, is it? About 8 years ago or so. And this was when Alex McGilvery was with the company, AMAC, and Andrew McLaughlin, other figures who have since left. But I've always had a great affection for this company, and it's an honor to be here. Let me tell you about this book. So this book is, as was alluded to, a history of the industry which you are in. Namely, this book is somewhat about you, or where you came from, not you individuals, but this company. And that is the industry whose business model is the attraction and resell of human attention, the selling of eyeballs, the rounding up of a crowd to sell to advertisers. You're very familiar, I think, with this business model because you work at a company whose primary revenue source is that business model. But you may be less familiar with where it came from, how it has evolved, and its future. In the next 20 minutes or so, I thought I'd talk about some of the major developments in the history of the harvesting of human attention. Historical, a few vignettes, not complete. The full story is in the book. And then at the end of the talk, I'll spend a little bit talking about the environment as I see it today, advertising markets, some of the tensions surrounding ad blockers and related ideas. So that's what we're going to see. So let's begin in history, and I guess somehow this went forward, to where the business model came from, the one that I described, of gathering up a crowd, offering something for free or very cheap, and then reselling the attention gained to advertisers. It began, as I see it, in the newspaper industry in New York City in the 1830s with the launch of this paper right here, the New York Sun, by a man named Benjamin Day. So here's the story with Benjamin Day and his newspaper. At the time in the 1830s, newspapers were not like they are today. Well, for one thing, they had really no pictures or anything like that. But for another thing, they were expensive and were limited to a very narrow clientele before this paper came. New York City had hundreds of thousands of people already. The newspapers had circulations of thousands. They were more like specialty newsletters. Their news was mostly political or financial, and they were boring. I mean, maybe interesting people to read them, but there was not, as one historian said, there was nothing in them to attract the eye of the average person. So Benjamin Day, who owned a printing house, had a different idea for a business. He thought, well, what would happen if I dramatically reduced the price of the newspaper to where it is, he didn't go all the way to free, but he went to 1 penny, where it's the kind of thing you just buy the same way you might buy a bar of soap. That was his thinking. And what if I made the stories much more interesting? What if I covered crime, gossip, prominent society stories? I don't think you can see it here, and I'm not even sure this is the right issue. But the lead story on the first issue was kind of a moving story about the suicide of a young man who had been separated from his fiancée and was going to be sent off to Indonesia. And so he took drugs and killed himself, a melancholy suicide. There were stories from police court about couples getting drunk and fighting with each other, playing on theirs. There were stories about the resale of slaves. In short, you go back and read this newspaper, it is fun to read. I mean, it's got a lot going on. It's got some juice to it. So he did this thing. And the interesting thing about his newspaper, the business part of it that's interesting, is that 1 cent he was losing money. So in some ways it was a suicidal proposition business-wise, unless he could get enough advertising revenue, and no one had ever been able to do that before. But he eventually lost money for a while, but eventually succeeded, started making money. Well, that was fine, except for he then began to attract competitors. One of the things that you'll see in the book is that competition in what I'm calling attentional industries is a little different than other industries. In most classic industries, the lowest price is the winner. Well, what do you do in industries where the prices are free or very low cost? Well, then the competition is to be the most interesting. And in the history, particularly of journalism, the winner of those competitions is usually the most lurid, the most exciting. The race is often to the bottom. And that's what happened in the case of the competition between the Sun and its newest competitor, the New York Herald. The New York Herald gained an enormous following with this story. Its owner was a strange guy named John Gordon Bennett, if I got it right, cross-eyed, former schoolmaster, who spoke of himself as this paragon of gentility, but for some reason, every single story that he wrote was either about death or sex or some combination. And he pioneered, in fact, reporting in person on crime scenes. This is a picture. There was a prostitute killed somewhere in New York by a man with a hatchet who then lit her body on fire. He went to the scene of the crime itself, described the woman as incredibly beautiful, like Venus de Milo, except for the mar of having her head hacked open by an axe. So this was a kind of reporting that no one had seen before. And pretty soon the race was on when it came to these two newspapers. There was also another newspaper, the Evening Standard or something, who had the very ingenious idea that sports would be where the important attention would be attracted to, and it's sort of a predecessor of ESPN. But anyway, the main competition was between these two newspapers. So to play the story out a little further, they'd invented the business model. Competition was ongoing. Benjamin Day started losing out to the lurid and exciting crime stories in the New York Tribune. And so they decided they had to do something. One day in 1835, out came a story, an exclusive, explaining that the New York Sun would be reporting on the discoveries of the astronomers using the world's largest telescope as to what they had found on the moon. And so, in a 6-part exclusive series, they gave authors, or their readers, an exclusive glimpse of the surface of the moon as revealed by the telescope. It had many features which we might find surprising, including large trees that resembled yews, a sort of horse that had a horn on its head, not called the unicorn, but clearly identifiable as such. And for some reason, most interesting to readers, the man bats, which were slightly less in stature than us, but apparently of similar intelligence, although not bound by our sense of ethics and prone to constant fornication. That was them. They offered pictures as well. Here's another more detailed look at the man bat. Understandably, so this was printed as news, has never been retracted, was never even revealed as not being true, because how were you supposed to reveal that this? It wasn't like there was a bunch of bloggers. No one else had a telescope that could see the moon. So it was largely accepted as a factual account. And as you might expect, the subscription numbers went through the roof. And through the device of reporting on what was on the moon, the Sun became the most successful, the widest circulation paper in the world, exceeding the English papers which had been established decades earlier. So I think you see from this episode that, as I said earlier, something interesting about these industries that make their money off human attention, that the competition is unusual, and there are often ethical questions that can come up when your business model relies at attracting as much attention by all means necessary. Let me now turn to a second episode, and this is where I want to describe when advertising itself. So there's two kinds of businesses I'm describing in this book. One is what I call the attention workers or attention brokers. These are the companies, Google's one of them, whose goal is to get as many users as possible to resell to advertisers. Then you have the advertising companies whose goal it is to, in one way or another, get people interested in a product or a service that they might not otherwise be interested in. Well, if they're already interested, why would they need advertising? So I know Google itself didn't advertise for years, actually, presuming that it was so good you didn't need anyone to advertise it. So there was a long period where advertising was confined to very specific products. This is an important, one of some of the early French advertising, which was important, I would suggest, for its use of, I guess, fairly obvious appeals to the unconscious or even the conscience. They mastered the ability, this is a discussion of their developments, of using bright colors, large fields, other features that maybe are more obvious, a sense of motion to try and attract attention. But even though advertisers had started to understand some of these techniques, there was still a sense that advertising was not for normal products. It was popular among patent medicines, among particular unusual services, some alcoholic beverages and some events. But mainline companies did not use advertising, which they considered two things, both ineffective. How do you ever prove it worked? And second of all, ineffective, and second of all, undignified. So what changed the status of advertising? How did it become mainstream? Well, this requires a look at World War I, and what I want to suggest was that the British government and its propaganda efforts in the First World War bear a lot of the responsibility for making advertising mainstream. The challenge that Britain faced, and we'll come to this in a second, was that it, in 1914, declared war on the German Empire having an army somewhat over 100,000 people. It had done so because it was obliged to with the treaty with Belgium. The German Imperial Army at that point had some 4 million soldiers and had already conquered a series of lesser countries. And so Britain, if it was going to face off Germany, needed to get an army quick. Now, long-standing British tradition had prohibited the conscription or the draft of soldiers. And so Lord Kitchener, who is pictured here, turned to what historians describe as the first mass propaganda campaign to try to recruit an army to fight the German military. And so you, for the first time, had the entry of government and the use of the scale of government, the ability to operate not 1 or 2 ads, but to print millions and millions of leaflets, millions of posters, putting this fellow in every single bus stop and wall, pointing his finger at you. In fact, there's a bit, I read the account of one person. He said, everywhere I went, this guy was following me, and he kept pointing at me, and I finally felt too guilty. I had to join the army. This became replicated. You've probably seen the American version, the Uncle Sam version of it, but this is the original, which is Lord Kitchener. There's efforts to make it seem a little more pleasant. One thing that is amazing about the British propaganda effort in World War I is that they had a war which already, by the early stages, people were dying in incredible, or being injured in incredible quality. So if you join the army, I think it's like, almost 50% chance you were going to end up somehow injured or dead. Nonetheless, people kept joining, and they took some efforts to try to make it seem a little more pleasant, and also held large rallies where they marched through towns. So this is before radio or other broadcast technologies, so you had to kind of march through people's towns and get their attention that way. The effort was an incredible success. The army was recruited. Britain was able to fight on the battlefield. It was so successful that the American began to copy the British efforts. And I think if you look at this, you can also see the influence of the previous commercial advertising rather obviously, the French invention of the poster. You can see that in this American propaganda, fairly effective. You have a monster, you have a half-naked woman, you have large fields of color, very strong messaging. And the American effort was also successful in creating an army, although America also used conscription. So what I think is important about World War I propaganda is it reveals a conversation that starts going on between industry and government as to the use of attention-gaining and advertising techniques. As I said, industry had felt suspicious of advertising and wondered whether it works. I'm sure Google actually plays an important role in showing that web advertising works, but it's always been a question for the advertising industry. Am I wasting my money? What is the point of running these ads at all? Personal note, when I ran for office at one point a few years ago, we ran some ads, and you kind of felt like, are you just throwing money into the ether? Because you can't really, it's really hard to tell, particularly with display advertising or broadcast advertising. But after, the proof of concept in some ways was World War I for advertising, I'm saying. Because after seeing these armies be raised by the force of advertising, propaganda, in the 1920s, industry and the large companies, which themselves were growing, began in dramatic ways to increase their spending on advertising and create the culture and the industry of advertising that we are familiar with today. So I want to turn to a third story now. One of the things I think is really important in the history of the harvesting of attention are a series of rituals or habits that direct how you spend your attention. And what I want to talk in particular is that ritual that dominated the 20th century known as prime time. That is, maybe let's think back to the 1950s or so. Maybe you experienced this as children. Maybe you still have this in your life, where after dinner, the family, or many members of the family, would go to the living room, sit down, and watch television for 3 or 4 hours. And every day. And in the case of a popular program, now we'll think about the 1950s, you might have 70 million people tuning in to I Love Lucy at 7 p.m., 70 or more million turning into the Ed Sullivan Show on Sunday nights, that you have this sort of mass ritual of people paying attention to one type of content. Something that you very rarely see today other than Super Bowls or the occasional presidential debate, that level of attention on one program, one content. So where did this come from? This is one of the stories in the book. I became curious in the invention of prime time. Well, I'll tell this story quickly, and it starts with a company known as Pepsodent toothpaste. So Pepsodent toothpaste was a leading brand of the 1920s. This is before Crest. Its competitor was Colgate, but Crest didn't exist yet. And Pepsodent used the some of the dominant advertising techniques of the 1920s, known as hard sell advertising. The basic premise of their ads and some of the other advertisers was to warn of the terrible things that would happen to you if you didn't use the product. So here you have the discovery of the idea. That's not an error, that's the part of the ad, that your teeth have plaque on them, and if you don't use Pepsodent, you will suffer from lack of white teeth. So this was a very successful advertising campaign. I'll show you another one while we're in this. This is some of the early days of targeted advertising. This is described in the book, but there was a discovery in the 1920s that the female consumer was the key to selling products, and therefore the beginnings of efforts targeted to women, usually warning of the risks of social disgrace or not getting married if they didn't use the product. So this is Listerine. Listerine was originally used for cleaning floors, I think its original purpose, and a battlefield disinfectant. It came under new management. They wanted to do something else with the product, so they had the idea of selling it to make your breath clean. And they then had the idea of selling it to women by warning that if you had bad breath, you may reach the dreadful age of, what do they say? The age of 30 without finding a husband. Eleanor, who was the star of these advertisements, was as charming and as beautiful as anyone else, but no one would tell her that she had halitosis. I think they made up that word for these ads. Bad breath, and therefore scared away all her suitors. So these ads had worked for a while, to go back to the primetime story, for Pepsodent, Pepsodent toothpaste. But by the late 1920s, the company was not doing well. A scientist at Columbia had published a devastating report showing that the toothpaste, the method of removing the whiteness, removing film, was highly corrosive, and in fact was just stripping the teeth of their enamel, and that it was dangerous to your health. So Pepsodent suffered from that. And they needed some way to bring the brand alive. Well, they had a new a manager, a man named Walter Templin, Canadian guy, and he had the idea of using radio. So this is one of the first times we see advertising, or this model move to a new medium. Radio in the 1920s was still not an advertising medium because, like the internet in the 1990s or the 80s, people considered it too important, too miraculous to consider advertising upon. But they had started to just have a few sponsorships. But at the time, most radio shows were music, kind of things that would blend into the background. Walter Templin noticed something like this. He noticed that there was a show coming on in Chicago at 7 p.m. that was making families stop in their tracks, gather around the radio set, and listen to it with absolute focus for 15 minutes a day. And so he realized here, by using the power of the radio, that he could penetrate the fortress of the household and deliver an advertising message directly to consumers who are absolutely focused on this program. The program was unlike other programs. It wasn't music or just mild entertainment, but it was an ongoing soap opera type show featuring two white men posing as black men, Amos and Andy. You would never really see them, and they didn't necessarily wear that, but they talked in what they considered to be Negro voices. And this was the Amos and Andy show. I apologize for the offensive content, but this is what it was. So this show, featuring a dialogue between these two fellows, captivated audiences. And what Templin did is he managed to turn this show, which has been a local Chicago show, into an NBC show, and therefore pioneer the first truly successful must-see TV or program that everyone would listen to. We have some evidence of how popular it was. Movie theaters would play the show in the theater for 15 minutes a day. They would play the show before their movies because otherwise people wouldn't come to the movies. And the rating systems, this is before Nielsen, so these were very rough estimates, but they estimated 40 million people were listening to this show every day. So you have an audience almost like, not like a Super Bowl audience, but a huge audience, much larger than Game of Thrones, every day listening to the thing, all with one advertisers, and it saved Pepsi toothpaste, and got everyone interested in the idea that prime time could be an incredibly valuable way of attracting audiences and selling a product. I think there's one more picture. Well, I want to leave some time for questions. I'll say one or two words about some of these other things. There is, as we follow this history forward, a return of the state in World War II to mass advertising and mass attention harvesting. This is the German advertisement for the Volksempfänger, the People's Radio. It says all of Germany listens to or hears the Führer. Germany took that primetime idea, which had become popular in America, and as the Germans or Nazis tended to do, took it to the next level. Not only did they have primetime, but it was required listening. In other words, it was, especially later in the Reich, you could be penalized, even put in jail, for not listening to the radio when you were supposed to listen. And they had a core of people rounding up everyone and moving them into radio halls so that they would listening. So a kind of must-see TV in a different kind of way. I must listen or go to jail. And that idea, the Germans during World War II maybe exceeded any other effort of mass attention harvesting. You had 80 million people listening to one voice, Hitler's voice, not every day, but whenever he wanted. And so you had a kind of complete focus of the entire state, nation on one source of information. You can talk about this later. It's often said, and I think it's true, that the media diet, the degree to which people pay attention to the same content, read the same stuff, or the degree to which they read different stuff, affects the character of a country and of a culture. If everyone is watching I Love Lucy or listening to Hitler, you tend to have a more conformist, a more homogenous and unified kind of country. In fact, that was the point of the German effort, was to try to create the subjugation of individual will until a sort of totalitarian supremacy of the state over the individual. And so some of those themes, when we think about our culture today, which is increasingly fragmented, people are critical of that, but there's downsides to being all under one voice as well, just so I'll put that out there. Some of the other things I talk about, there's the equivalent. I wanted to say one word about another theme in the book, which is that of consumer revolts. So throughout the history of advertising and the attention merchants' rise, there have been periodic moments of resistance where consumers kind of get fed up. They feel like there's too many ads. They want to do something about it. Ad blocking currently might be one of those types of revolts. I trace one of the earliest technological versions to Zenith, the Zenith company, which in the 1920s and 30s was a leading tech firm, American tech firm, kind of the radical of its day. They did serious experimentation with their radio station in trying to broadcast brain waves of the announcers to people. So they experimented with like telepathy techniques. They just said, this show will take you where no radio program has taken you before. They would broadcast the thoughts of the announcer, and then people were supposed to write them down and mail them in. I'm not sure how successful they were. They didn't report on that, but I know they tried this. So they were a little bit of a weird company. Occasionally, very eccentric people end up in the leadership of tech companies. I'm sure you're familiar with that phenomenon. And maybe the forerunner of that particular trend was the head of Zenith. His name was Commodore MacDonald. He called himself the Commodore because he'd been in the Naval Reserve, and he had an enormous ship, like Larry Ellison or something. He had this enormous boat that he parked in Chicago's harbor and then had wild parties that could be heard across the city in his boat. One thing about him that was interesting, that affected history, I'll say, is that he detested commercials and advertising. So he thought it had ruined radio and was ruining television. And so he, one day, gave a speech to his engineers. He gave challenges to his engineers. I want you to do this. And he said, I want you to come up with a technology that will allow the viewer to kill or block advertising. This is in 1953, he gave the speech. So his engineers, huddled around, spent a couple of years. And the winning technology was the one pictured here. Later variants looked more like a gun. And this is what we now call the remote control. The technology, the original idea was to shoot out those annoying commercials or advertisements, basically by letting you turn down the volume or switch channels. So, the remote control might seem like a humble device, but it actually has, if you think about it, a big role in history of human attention, because its basic philosophy was to give back control to the viewer or the reader as to what they're watching by making it easier to sort of just click away from stuff you didn't want. Whether that was ultimately good or bad for us, I'll leave for another discussion. But that basic principle, which you also later see in the VCR or in TiVo, that you take command of your attention, my view begins with the remote control. The book also covers the rise of celebrity culture. I won't say too much about it. There's the first magazine to devote itself only to the coverage of celebrities. Celebrities have unusual power to attract human attention. No one really understands why, I don't think, but it's definitely the case. And the book also finds reason to talk about Space Invaders as the beginnings of computers as a tool or a possibility of trying to get a lot of attention. Of course, you paid for quarters, not ads with Space Invaders, but it had a role in pioneering the idea that computer screen could somehow be part of entertainment. I want to sort of fast forward. The book also spends a lot of time talking about our times, but I'll leave that to you. I want to fast forward and talk a little bit about our times in context of history. So I think we are at an unusual period, although these industries are always evolving. There is, I think, the makings of some resistance to advertising at this point. You look at the rise of Netflix and Amazon Prime and other advertising-free television suggests that the traditional model of television, which was anchored on ads, is in some trouble. I think 50% or so of television revenue is now paid revenue. On the web, the advertising model, at least for web companies, does remain dominant. And I think the questions for the future is as to how far that model can go, whether some of the main platforms will need to find other revenue models or whether they can continue with this one. Obviously, an important question for this company. And whether whether an alternative, what we're witnessing is maybe the transfer of all that advertising revenue that was once in television coming over to the web and permanently staying there. And what, if any, effect does some of the resistance and ad blocking have on the future of advertising? I think these are all important questions. I don't necessarily have all of the answers, but I thank you for your time. Thank you very much.